Some secrets aren't meant to be discovered by accident. They're meant to stay buried in the back alleys of old cities, behind doors you were never supposed to open. But when you're lost, really lost, not just geographically, but in life, you start walking down paths that lead to places you can't forget. I thought I was just looking for my hotel. Instead, I found something that changed everything I believed about the world, about trust, about the line between helping someone and destroying them. They say curiosity killed the cat, but they don't tell you what happens when you survive the killing and have to live with what you've seen. 3 months later, I'm still in Chiang Mai, not because I want to be, but because leaving feels like abandoning the truth. And the truth, once you've seen it, becomes your responsibility. If our stories resonate with you, don't forget to like, comment, and tell us where you're watching from. This story was shared with us by one of our longtime viewers. He asked us not to share his name, but he wanted his experience heard. I came to Chiang Mai because I had nowhere else to go. 58 years old, divorced, retired from 23 years of adjusting insurance claims in Portland. My ex-wife got the house, I got the freedom. And honestly, I wasn't sure which one of us got the better deal. The settlement gave me enough to live modestly somewhere warm for a year, maybe 2 if I was careful. Thailand seemed like the obvious choice. Cheap living, good weather, and far enough from Oregon that I wouldn't accidentally run into anyone from my old life at the grocery store. I'd been in the city for 3 days, staying at a guest house near the old quarter that cost $12 a night and came with a shower that only worked if you held the handle just right. My routine was simple. Wake up around 10, find a cafe with Wi-Fi, drink coffee until my hands shook, then wander the markets until evening. It wasn't much of a life, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, nobody was asking me to explain myself or justify my choices. That third night, I'd stayed late at the Saturday night market, buying things I didn't need and eating food I couldn't pronounce. Street pad thai, some kind of grilled meat on a stick, a mango so ripe it dripped down my chin. The vendors were packing up, and the crowds were thinning when I realized I had no idea which direction led back to my guest house. The narrow streets all looked the same in the darkness, and the landmarks I'd memorized during the day disappeared behind shuttered storefronts and parked motorcycles. My phone showed 2% battery. I'd forgotten to charge it again, something that happened more often since the divorce. My ex-wife used to handle details like that, reminders about charging cables and backup batteries. Now I was on my own, and apparently I was terrible at keeping myself functional. The screen went black just as I was trying to open a map application. "Shit," I muttered, standing under a flickering streetlight and looking at my useless phone. The familiar sounds of the market vendors calling out prices, motorbikes puttering past, tourists laughing faded as I walked deeper into what I hoped was the right direction. The streets grew narrower, the lights dimmer, and the comforting chaos of the city gave way to something quieter and more unsettling. I turned down a swar that looked promising, then another, then another. Each turn took me further from anything I recognized. The concrete beneath my feet cracked and sprouted weeds. The neat rows of shophouses gave way to buildings that leaned against each other, like tired old men. Some windows were boarded up. Others glowed with the blue light of television screens behind heavy curtains. My footsteps echoed off the narrow walls. The air smelled like cooking oil and something else, something sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. I was starting to panic. The kind of cold, logical panic that comes when you realize you've made a series of small mistakes that have added up to one big problem. I was lost in a foreign city, with no phone, no map, and no real grasp of the local language beyond "hello," "thank you," and "where is the bathroom?" That's when I saw the light. Not the harsh fluorescent glow of a 7-Eleven or the warm yellow of a restaurant, but something softer, more intimate. It was coming from the back of what looked like an abandoned shophouse, filtering through cracks in a wooden door. I could hear voices quiet, speaking Thai, But there was something comforting about the sound of human conversation after 20 minutes of walking through empty streets. I approached slowly, my leather sandals scuffing against broken concrete. The building was old, probably built in the 1960s or 70s, with the kind of architecture that had once been modern but now just looked tired. The front windows were covered with newspapers, and a rusty metal gate blocked what had probably once been a shop entrance. But around the side, down a narrow alley barely wide enough for one person, that light beckoned like a lighthouse. I told myself I was just going to ask for directions. Maybe borrow a phone charger. These were good people, I reasoned, good Samaritans who would help a confused old American find his way back to familiar territory. I had no reason to think otherwise. I had no reason to think at all, really, except that I was tired and lost and desperate for any kind of human connection, even with strangers who didn't speak my language. The voices grew clearer as I got closer, and I realized one of them was speaking English. Broken, accented English, but English nonetheless. A woman's voice. Older. Patient. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was soothing. Almost maternal. It reminded me of my own mother reading to me when I was sick as a child, that gentle rhythm that made everything seem like it would be all right. I reached the door and paused. My hand raised to knock. Through a crack in the wood, I could see inside. What I saw made me freeze, my knuckles inches from the splintered surface. A young woman, maybe 22 or 23, was sitting on a thin mattress on the floor. She had blonde hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and was wearing clothes that looked like they hadn't been changed in days. A wrinkled t-shirt and shorts that were too big for her thin frame. Her skin was pale, almost grey, and her eyes had that unfocused look I'd seen in people coming out of dental surgery. She was holding a bowl of soup, but her hands were shaking so badly that most of it was spilling onto her lap. An older Thai woman knelt beside her, speaking in that gentle voice I'd heard from outside. She was probably in her mid-40s, wearing a clean floral dress and plastic sandals. Her hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she had the kind of face that should have belonged to someone's favorite aunt: round cheeks, warm eyes, the suggestion of laugh lines. She was holding the girl's hand steady, helping guide the spoon to her mouth. "There we go," she said in English, her accent thick but clear. "Slowly now. You need to eat to feel better." My first thought was relief. Here was proof that there were still good people in the world, still strangers willing to help someone in need. The girl was obviously sick, food poisoning, maybe, or some kind of bug that had knocked her flat. The older woman was taking care of her, probably a local who'd found her collapsed somewhere and brought her inside to recover. But something nagged at me, some detail that didn't fit the picture I was constructing. The girl's eyes weren't just unfocused, they were glassy, dilated. She moved like someone underwater, each gesture slow and disconnected. And when she looked up at the woman helping her, there was no recognition in her expression, no gratitude or awareness, just emptiness. I shifted my weight to get a better view, and that's when I noticed the windows. They weren't just covered with newspapers from the outside, they had bars on them, thick iron bars that had been painted black but were now showing rust around the edges. And the door I was peering through had a heavy padlock hanging from a metal hasp, open now but clearly designed to lock from the outside. My stomach dropped. This wasn't a good Samaritan helping a sick tourist. This was something else entirely, something that made my hands sweat and my heart race, even though I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. The girl wasn't getting better, she was being kept. But kept for what? And why? I wanted to back away, to pretend I'd never seen anything, to find my way back to the main road and forget this narrow alley existed. But I couldn't move. I stood there, eye pressed to the crack in the door, watching this gentle-seeming woman spoon soup into a drugged girl's mouth, while my brain tried to process what I was actually seeing. "That's my good girl," the woman said, and there was something in her tone that made my skin crawl. Not quite motherly, not quite medical. Something else. Something possessive. The blonde girl's head lolled to one side, and for a moment I thought she was going to fall over. But the Thai woman caught her, eased her back against the wall, and began stroking her hair with slow, repetitive motions. "Sleep now," she whispered. "Tomorrow will be better. Tomorrow. We have visitors coming." I stepped back from the door so fast I nearly fell. My foot came down on something that crunched broken glass, maybe, or plastic. The sound echoed in the narrow alley like a gunshot. The voices inside stopped immediately. I held my breath, pressing myself against the opposite wall and praying that whoever was inside would assume the noise had come from the street, from a cat or a motorbike or anything other than a 58-year-old American man who'd stumbled into something he wasn't supposed to see. But the door opened before I could even think about running. The Thai woman stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the warm light from inside. She looked exactly as I'd seen her through the crack. Middle-aged, matronly, the kind of person you'd trust to watch your luggage or give you directions to the nearest temple. She wasn't carrying a weapon. She wasn't screaming or threatening me. She was just standing there, looking at me with mild curiosity, as if finding a lost foreigner outside her door was the most natural thing in the world. "Hello," she said in English, her voice the same gentle tone I'd heard her use with the blonde girl. "You are lost?" I opened my mouth to lie, to make up some story about looking for my hotel or trying to find a taxi, but what came out was the truth. I said, "I'm lost." She smiled, and it was a genuinely warm smile, the kind that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made her whole face light up. If I'd met her at a market or in a restaurant, I would have thought she was delightful, a local character, someone who'd lived in Chiang Mai her whole life and knew every street, every shortcut, every family story worth telling. "My name is Siralawan," she said, stepping aside and gesturing for me to come closer. "You look tired and worried. Come inside. I will make tea, and we can call a taxi to take you back to where you need to go." Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run. The bars on the windows, the drugged girl, the heavy lock on the door, none of it added up to the kind of place where you stop for tea and directions. But I was genuinely lost. My phone was dead, and this woman was offering exactly what I needed. Help from a local who spoke English and knew how to navigate the city. More than that, I was curious. The insurance adjuster in me, the part of my brain that had spent decades investigating suspicious claims and looking for the truth behind people's stories, wanted to know what was really going on here. Was the girl actually sick? Was this some kind of medical facility? Was I jumping to conclusions based on a few seconds of observation and 20 years of watching too many crime documentaries? "Thank you," I said, taking a step toward the door. "That's very kind of you." Siralawan's smile widened. "Of course. We must help each other, yes? Please, come in." The room inside was larger than it had appeared from outside, with a low ceiling and concrete floors covered by thin rugs in faded colors. The blonde girl was still sitting against the wall, but now her eyes were closed and her breathing was deep and regular. She looked peaceful, almost childlike, curled up on her mattress with a thin blanket pulled up to her chin. But as my eyes adjusted to the light, I began to notice other details. There were more mattresses along the far wall, each with its own small pile of belongings, clothes, toiletries, a few personal items that looked like they belonged to different people. Young women, based on the sizes and styles. The chart I'd glimpsed earlier was more visible now, a handwritten grid with photographs and what looked like names and numbers. "Please, sit," Siralawan said, gesturing to a plastic chair near a small table. "I will make tea." She moved to a corner of the room where a hot plate and electric kettle sat on a folding table. As she prepared the tea, she kept up a steady stream of chatter in her accented English. "You are American, yes? I can tell from your shoes. Americans always wear those sandals. Very practical. Very comfortable. I have many American friends who come to Chiang Mai. They love the culture, the food, the weather. Much better than cold winters, I think." I sat in the plastic chair and tried to appear relaxed while my mind raced. Yes, I'm from Portland, Oregon. Just visiting for a couple of weeks. Portland! She clapped her hands together as if I'd just told her I was from her hometown. I know Portland. Very beautiful city. Rain all the time, yes? My cousin lives in Seattle. Similar weather. She says she comes to Thailand every year just to remember what sunshine feels like. The conversation was so normal, so pleasant, that I started to wonder if I'd misunderstood what I'd seen earlier. Maybe the girl really was sick. Maybe this was some kind of informal medical facility, a place where people came when they couldn't afford proper health care. Maybe the bars on the windows were for security, to keep thieves out rather than to keep anyone in. Siralawan brought me a cup of tea in a chipped ceramic mug. It was hot and sweet, with a taste I couldn't identify. Herbs, maybe, or spices I wasn't familiar with. She sat across from me in another plastic chair and sipped her own tea, watching me with those warm, grandmotherly eyes. So, she said, you are staying where? What hotel? I told her the name of my guest house, and she nodded knowingly. Ah, yes, I know this place. Very good value. Clean rooms, friendly staff. You are maybe 15 minutes by taxi from here. Not so far, but the streets are confusing at night, especially if you don't know the way. What is this place? I asked, gesturing around the room. Do you live here? This is my clinic, she said without hesitation. I help young women who have problems. Drug addiction, mostly. Girls who come to Thailand looking for adventure but find only trouble instead. They spend all their money on drugs, lose their passports, get sick from bad food or contaminated water. The government facilities, they are not always understanding. So I provide a place where they can recover safely. She pointed to the sleeping blonde girl. Like her, Sarah. She is from Australia. Came to Thailand 6 months ago, fell in with bad people. They gave her heroin, took all her money, left her sick on the street. I found her 2 days ago. Now she is getting clean, getting healthy. In a few days, I will help her contact her family, get new documents, go home. It was a plausible story, told with conviction and backed up by visible evidence. The girl, the medical supplies I could see on a shelf near the tea making station, the general atmosphere of care and concern. And yet something about it felt rehearsed, like a speech she'd given many times before. That's very generous of you, I said, taking another sip of the tea. It tasted stronger now, almost bitter, and left a strange coating on my tongue. How do you fund something like this? It must be expensive. Oh, I have many friends who help, Siralawan said, her smile brightening. Western men mostly. Expats who live here. Tourists who visit regularly. They understand how easy it is for young people to get into trouble so far from home. They donate money, volunteer their time. It is a community effort. She leaned forward, her expression becoming more earnest. In fact, if you are interested, you could help too. We always need funding for food, medicine, transportation to help girls get home, and someone with your maturity, your life experience. You could be a counselor. Many of these girls, they have father issues, you know. They need positive male figures to help them heal. The tea was making me feel strange, not sick, exactly, but heavy and disconnected, like I was viewing the conversation through thick glass. I set the mug down and tried to focus on what she was saying, but her words seemed to come from very far away. I should probably go, I said, surprised by how slurred my voice sounded. It's getting late, and I have an early day tomorrow. Of course, Siralawan said, standing up quickly. Let me call a taxi for you. But first, finish your tea. It's a special blend, very good for digestion. You don't want to waste it. She moved to a corner of the room where an old landline phone sat on a wooden crate. As she dialed, I looked around more carefully, trying to catalogue what I was seeing while my vision was still clear. The chart on the wall definitely contained photographs, headshots of young women, mostly blonde, mostly Western-looking. Next to each photo was a column of numbers that could have been ages, dates, or prices. The blonde girl, Sarah, if that was really her name, shifted in her sleep and mumbled something unintelligible. One of her arms flopped out from under the blanket, and I could see track marks on the inside of her elbow, but they looked fresh, not like the old scars of a long-term addict. More like someone had been injecting her recently, regularly. My stomach lurched, and not just from the tea. This wasn't a recovery center. This was something else, something much worse. And I was sitting in the middle of it, drugged and defenseless, while this grandmother-looking woman made phone calls in rapid Thai. I caught fragments of her conversation. Farang, which I knew meant foreigner, and what sounded like American, and useful. But my Thai was limited to restaurant orders and basic pleasantries. I had no idea what she was really saying, or to whom. The room was starting to spin slightly, and I gripped the arms of the plastic chair to steady myself. Whatever had been in that tea was working fast, making my thoughts slow and muddy. I needed to leave immediately, before I became as helpless as the girl sleeping against the wall. The taxi. It will be here in 10 minutes. Sirilawan said, hanging up the phone and returning to her seat. Very reliable driver. He knows exactly where your guest house is. Actually, I said, forcing myself to stand up despite the way the room tilted around me. I think I'll walk. The fresh air will do me good. Oh no. No, she said quickly, moving to block my path to the door. It is not safe for you to walk alone at night. Too easy to get lost again, and you look very tired. Please, sit down, rest until the taxi comes. But I was already moving toward the door, my legs unsteady but functional. The lock was still open, hanging loose from its hasp. All I had to do was push past this small, middle-aged woman and step back into the alley. From there, I could find my way back to the main road, flag down a real taxi, get back to my guest house and forget this whole encounter had happened. I really appreciate your help, I said, reaching for the door handle. But I need to go. That's when I heard the footsteps outside. Heavy boots on concrete. More than one person, moving with purpose. Sirilawan heard them too, and her expression changed. The warm, grandmotherly smile disappeared, replaced by something harder and more calculating. I think, she said quietly, you should sit back down. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. I could hear voices speaking Thai in low, urgent tones, male voices, young and strong, and I realized that the taxi Sirilawan had called wasn't coming to take me back to my guest house. It was coming to take me somewhere else entirely. I looked at the sleeping girl, at the chart on the wall, at the bars on the windows, and finally understood what I'd stumbled into. This wasn't a medical facility or a recovery center. This was a warehouse. A place where young women were kept, drugged, and prepared for something unspeakable. And I wasn't a potential volunteer or donor. I was a witness who had seen too much and needed to be dealt with. My hand was on the door handle when it opened from the outside. 2 young Thai men entered, both in their 20s, both carrying coils of rope. They looked at me without surprise, as if they'd been expecting to find me there. This is Leo, Sirilawan said in English, her voice still pleasant, but with an edge I hadn't heard before. He got lost and wandered in here by accident. We've been having a nice chat about Portland. One of the men said something in Thai that made Sirilawan nod. The other was looking at me with the kind of professional assessment I'd seen in mechanics evaluating a broken car. Not hostile, exactly, but utterly without emotion. They will drive you back to your hotel, Sirilawan said to me. Very safe, very reliable, no charge. But I could see the rope in their hands, and I could see the way they were positioning themselves between me and the door. Whatever ride they were planning to give me, it wasn't going to end at my guest house. The tea had made me sluggish and confused, but it hadn't completely disabled me. Adrenaline was starting to cut through the drug fog, sharpening my focus, and giving me back some control over my limbs. I had one chance, maybe 2 seconds, before these men subdued me and loaded me into whatever vehicle was waiting outside. I clutched my chest and dropped to my knees, gasping and making choking sounds. My heart... I wheezed, trying to look like I was having a cardiac episode. Can't breathe. It was a performance born of desperation and inspired by every medical drama I'd ever watched. I rolled onto my side, clutching my left arm and making the kind of sounds that suggest someone is dying right in front of you. The 2 men looked confused, speaking rapidly to each other in Thai. Sirilawan knelt beside me, her face showing genuine concern for the first time since I'd met her. "What is wrong?" she asked. "Are you sick? Hospital?" I gasped. Need. Hospital. In the moment of confusion that followed, while all 3 of them were focused on my apparent medical emergency, I rolled toward the door and then exploded upward, pushing past the nearest man and diving into the alley. I heard shouting behind me, but I was already running, my sandals slapping against the broken concrete as I fled deeper into the maze of narrow streets. I had no idea where I was going. The drug in my system made everything feel surreal and disconnected, like I was running through a dream. The walls of the building seemed to stretch upward into infinity, and the few streetlights I passed created islands of orange light in an ocean of darkness. I could hear pursuit behind me, voices calling in Thai, the sound of running feet, but I didn't dare look back. I turned left, then right, then left again, following whatever path seemed darkest and most likely to provide concealment. The architecture changed as I ran, the neat shophouses giving way to older, more ramshackle structures that leaned against each other for support. Some had lights in the windows, others were obviously abandoned. I passed clotheslines stretched between buildings, motorcycles parked in doorways, the occasional cat that looked at me with glowing eyes before disappearing into the shadows. My lungs were burning, and my legs felt like rubber, but I kept running. Behind me, the voices were getting fainter, but I knew that didn't mean I was safe. This was their neighborhood, their territory. They knew every alley, every dead end, every hiding place. I was just a lost American stumbling around in the dark, leaving a trail that any competent tracker could follow. I turned another corner and found myself in what looked like a covered market, long since closed for the night. Stalls lined both sides of a narrow corridor, their metal shutters pulled down and padlocked. But the corridor continued deeper into the building, branching off in different directions, and I realized I wasn't just in a market, I was in some kind of connected complex, multiple buildings that had been joined together over the years to create a labyrinth of passageways and rooms. I slowed to a walk, trying to control my breathing, and listen for sounds of pursuit. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the distant hum of air conditioning units and the occasional creak of settling wood. But as I moved deeper into the complex, I began to see lights, not the harsh fluorescence of the market stalls, but the same warm, intimate lighting I'd seen in Sirilawan's room. I followed the lights, moving as quietly as I could through corridors that seemed to go on forever. And what I found made me understand that what I'd seen in that first room was just the tip of something much larger and more organized than I'd imagined. Behind one partially open door, I saw rows of bunk beds, each occupied by a sleeping figure. Young women, mostly, but some who looked even younger. They were all motionless, all breathing with the deep, regular rhythm of heavy sedation. The room smelled like disinfectant, and something else, something sweet and chemical that made my stomach turn. Behind another door, I glimpsed what looked like a commercial kitchen, with industrial-sized pots and dozens of bowls arranged on metal tables. The bowls contained soup, the same kind I'd seen Sirilawan feeding to the blonde girl. But there were so many of them, enough to feed 50 people, maybe more. A third door revealed an office space with computers, filing cabinets, and walls covered with photographs. Not just headshots this time, but full-body photos, some clothed, some not. Each photo had a number written in the corner, and below it, columns of text in what looked like multiple languages. Thai, English, maybe Chinese or Japanese. I pulled out my phone, grateful that the 2% battery I'd had earlier was somehow still holding. The screen was dim, but it was enough to take photos. I moved quickly through the office, capturing images of the walls, the computer screens, the filing cabinets. Most of the files were in Thai, but some contained documents in English: invoices, shipping manifests, what looked like travel itineraries. One folder, left open on the desk, contained a list of names and addresses. Western names, with locations in the United States, Australia, Canada, and Europe. Next to each name was a dollar amount, ranging from $5,000 to $20,000. At the bottom of the page, someone had written, "Spring collection final payment due," in neat handwriting. My phone battery finally died just as I was photographing what looked like a client roster. The screen went black, leaving me in darkness broken only by the glow from the hallway. I heard voices in the distance, not the panicked shouting from earlier, but calm, methodical conversation. They were searching the complex systematically, room by room, and they were getting closer. I needed to find a way out, but every corridor I explored seemed to lead to more rooms, more evidence of what was clearly a massive operation. This wasn't some small-scale trafficking ring run by one woman out of an abandoned shophouse. This was an industrial operation with dozens of victims, multiple facilities, and what appeared to be an international client base. The voices were getting closer. I could hear them checking doors, speaking in low tones to each other. Soon they would reach the office where I was hiding, and then there would be nowhere left to run. But as I stood there in the darkness, trying to plan my next move, I heard something else, the sound of running water. I followed the sound through another doorway and found myself in what had once been a bathroom, though it had been abandoned long enough for the fixtures to rust and the tiles to crack. But the sound of water was coming from below, from a drainage pipe that led down through the floor. I knelt beside it and realized I could feel air movement, the pipe connected to some kind of tunnel or drain system that ran beneath the building. It was a desperate gamble, but it was the only option I had. I pulled up the metal grate covering the drain and lowered myself into the pipe. It was barely wide enough for my shoulders, and the smell was nauseating, but I could see light at the far end. I crawled through the tunnel on my hands and knees, trying not to think about what I was crawling through or what would happen if I got stuck. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, but eventually I saw stars above me and realized I was emerging into some kind of canal or drainage ditch. I pulled myself out of the pipe and found myself in a part of Chiang Mai I didn't recognize: industrial buildings, empty lots, the kind of area where respectable tourists never venture. I was soaked, filthy, and still feeling the effects of whatever drug had been in that tea. My hands were shaking, and I couldn't seem to catch my breath. But I was alive, and I was free, and I had evidence of what I'd seen stored on my phone. All I had to do was find my way back to civilization, charge my phone, and decide what to do with the most horrifying discovery of my life. It took me an hour to find a main road, and another hour to convince a taxi driver to pick up a muddy, soaking wet foreigner who couldn't explain where he'd been or why he looked like he'd been crawling through sewers. But eventually I made it back to my guest house, where I stood under the shower until the hot water ran out and tried to process what had happened. I had stumbled into something enormous and evil, something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. But I was also the only person who had seen it and lived to tell about it. The question was, what was I going to do with that knowledge? I plugged in my phone and waited for it to charge enough to show me the photos I'd taken. When the screen finally came to life, I scrolled through the images with growing horror. They were all there. The walls of photographs, the client lists, the shipping manifests. Evidence of a trafficking operation that spanned multiple countries and involved dozens, maybe hundreds, of young women. But as I stared at the photos, I realized how useless they were. I had no idea where I'd been, no way to guide police back to that complex of buildings. The streets all looked the same, and I'd been too panicked and drugged to pay attention to landmarks. I had evidence of crimes, but no way to prove where those crimes were taking place. And even if I could find the location again, who was I going to tell? I was a retired insurance adjuster from Portland, with no connections to law enforcement and no credibility with local authorities. My Thai was minimal, my understanding of the legal system non-existent. For all I knew, some of the people I might report this to were already involved in the operation. I spent the next 3 days researching human trafficking in Thailand, reading reports from international organizations and trying to understand the scope of the problem. What I learned was sobering. Thailand was a major hub for trafficking, with operations that moved women and children across borders for forced labor and sexual exploitation. The networks were sophisticated, well-funded, and often had connections to local officials. I found contact information for several anti-trafficking organizations and sent them carefully worded emails describing what I'd witnessed. Most never responded. Those that did asked for more specific information, locations, names, evidence that would hold up in court. They were polite but skeptical, and I couldn't blame them. My story sounded like the paranoid ramblings of a disturbed expat. But I couldn't let it go. Every night, I lay awake thinking about the faces I'd seen in those photographs, the drugged girls sleeping on thin mattresses, the industrial kitchen preparing soup for dozens of victims. I started drinking more, buying bottles of local whiskey from the 7-Eleven and consuming them alone in my guesthouse room while I tried to make sense of what I'd experienced. My 2-week vacation turned into a month, then 6 weeks. I changed guest houses 3 times, partly for security reasons and partly because the staff kept asking questions about why I was staying so long. I hired motorcycle taxi drivers to take me through different parts of the city, hoping to recognize something from that night. I spent hours walking through narrow swa, looking for the alley where I'd first seen that light. Nothing. The city had swallowed that place like it had never existed, and I began to wonder if the drugs in the tea had caused me to hallucinate the whole thing. Maybe there had been no trafficking operation, no drugged girls, no industrial complex filled with evidence of international crime. Maybe I was just a lonely, divorced man having some kind of breakdown in a foreign country. But the photos on my phone were real. The terror I'd felt was real. And somewhere in this city, young women were being held against their will, drugged and prepared for God knows what kind of fate. That's when I started noticing I was being followed. It began subtly, the same motorcycle appearing behind my taxi on multiple occasions, the same face in different coffee shops, the feeling of being watched when I walked down busy streets. I told myself I was being paranoid, that the stress of what I'd seen was making me imagine threats that didn't exist. But paranoia turned to certainty when I returned to my guest house one evening to find that my room had been searched. Nothing was stolen, but my belongings had been moved. My laptop had been opened and closed, leaving fingerprints on the screen. My passport had been photographed. I could tell because it wasn't in exactly the same position I'd left it in. The next morning, I found a note slipped under my door. It was written in English, in neat handwriting that looked like it might belong to an educated woman. Tourists, who get lost sometimes, never find their way home, it said. Perhaps it is time for you to continue your journey. I stared at the note for a long time, my hands shaking as the implications sank in. They knew where I was staying. They knew I had seen something I wasn't supposed to see, and they were giving me one chance to walk away before they made sure I disappeared permanently. Every rational part of my brain screamed at me to pack my bags, get to the airport, and take the next flight back to Portland. I could go home, return to my quiet divorced life, and pretend none of this had ever happened. It would be easy, safe, smart. But I kept thinking about those girls. The blonde one, Sarah, or whatever her real name, was sleeping drugged and helpless on that thin mattress. The photographs on the walls, dozens of young faces with numbers written beneath them, like they were inventory in a warehouse. The client lists with names and addresses from around the world. If I left now, nothing would change. The operation would continue, more girls would disappear, and the people responsible would never face consequences for what they were doing. I would save myself, but I would abandon everyone else. I was still wrestling with that decision when I met Jin. I was sitting in an internet cafe near the university, using their Wi-Fi to research flights back to the United States, when a young man at the computer next to mine started speaking to me in English. "Excuse me," he said quietly, "but I couldn't help noticing what you're looking at. Are you researching human trafficking in Thailand?" I turned to look at him, mid-20s, Asian American, wearing jeans and a university t-shirt. He had intelligent eyes and the kind of earnest expression that belonged to someone who still believed the world could be changed through journalism and activism. "Maybe," I said carefully. "Why?" "My name is Jin Watanabe," he said, extending his hand. "I'm a freelance journalist, working on a story about trafficking networks in Southeast Asia. I've been trying to get reliable sources for months, but most people are too scared to talk." I shook his hand but didn't offer my name. "What makes you think I know anything about that?" "Because you've been searching for the same terms I search for," he said. "Anti-trafficking organizations, police corruption in Thailand, missing persons reports from Western countries, and because you look like someone who's seen something that's keeping you awake at night." He was right about the sleeping part. I'd been living on maybe 3 hours a night for weeks, sustained by coffee and anxiety, and the kind of nervous energy that comes from carrying a secret too big for one person to handle. "Even if I did know something," I said, "why would I tell a stranger in an internet cafe?" "Because," Jin said, lowering his voice, "I think you want to do the right thing, but you don't know how. And I think you're scared that if you go to the local police, your information will end up in the wrong hands." He pulled out a business card and handed it to me. It had his name, a Bangkok phone number, and the logo of an online news organization I'd never heard of. "I've been investigating a trafficking network that operates out of Chiang Mai," he continued. "Multiple facilities, international connections, protection from local officials. But I need a Western witness to make the story credible to international media, someone who's actually seen the operation firsthand." I looked at the business card, then at Jin's face, trying to decide if he was legitimate or if this was some kind of elaborate trap. The timing was too convenient, a journalist appearing just when I was trying to decide what to do with the information I'd gathered. "How do I know you're who you say you are?" I asked. Jin opened his laptop and showed me his previous articles, investigations into labor trafficking in Malaysia, a piece about corruption in Bangkok's police force, an expose on illegal adoption rings in Cambodia. His byline appeared on several different websites, and the stories were detailed, well-researched, and focused on the kind of systemic problems that mainstream media often ignored. "I've been working on this story for 8 months, he said. "I know about a woman named Sirilawan who runs operations out of the old quarter. I know about the connected buildings, the drugged victims, the client lists. But I can't get anyone to go on record, and I can't get inside the facilities." My blood went cold. "How do you know that name?" "Because I've been tracking her network for months. She's not just some local criminal, she's part of an international operation that moves women between Thailand, Cambodia, and Myanmar. The profits go back to organized crime groups in several countries." Jin leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "But here's what I really need you to understand. If you've seen something, if you have evidence, then you're already involved whether you want to be or not. These people don't just let witnesses walk away. Your only protection is making sure the story gets told publicly, with enough detail and credibility that silencing you would bring more attention than they can afford." I thought about the note under my door, the feeling of being watched, the way my room had been searched. Jin was right. I was already past the point of being able to pretend none of this had happened. "What would you need from me?" I asked. "Your story. The photos on your phone, testimony about what you saw and where you saw it, and your willingness to be identified as a source, because anonymous tips don't carry enough weight to get this kind of story the attention it deserves." "And then what?" "I spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder." "Maybe," Jin said honestly. "But the alternative is spending the rest of your life knowing you could have stopped something evil and chose not to, and that's assuming they let you live that long anyway." We talked for another hour, and Jin laid out what he knew about the operation and what he needed to complete his investigation. The trafficking network was larger than I'd imagined, with connections to similar operations in other countries and a client base that included wealthy businessmen, politicians, and even some Western tourists who came to Southeast Asia specifically for access to trafficked women. Jin had been trying to infiltrate the network for months, but as a young Asian man, he couldn't pose as a potential client or volunteer. He needed someone older, Western, male, someone who fit the profile of the men who funded these operations. "I'm not asking you to go back there," he said, "but I need you to help me understand the layout, the security, the way the operation works, and I need your photos as evidence." That night, I sat in my guest house room with Jin's business card in my hand, trying to decide if I trusted him enough to share what I knew. The rational part of my brain said this was my chance to hand over the responsibility to someone who knew how to handle it properly, but another part of me wondered if I was about to make everything worse. I called the number on the card. "I'll help you," I told Jin when he answered, "but I want to know everything about your plan before we start." We met the next day at a coffee shop near the university, and Jin explained his strategy. He had been building relationships with anti-trafficking organizations, international law enforcement agencies, and media outlets that specialized in investigative journalism. His plan was to publish a comprehensive exposé that would name names, provide evidence, and put enough international pressure on Thai authorities that they would have no choice but to act. But he warned me that going public would have consequences. Once the story was published, I could never safely return to Thailand. The network would know I was the source, and they had connections that reached far beyond Chiang Mai. "There's something else," Jin said. "I've been hearing rumors that the network is planning to move operations soon. Some kind of pressure from local law enforcement, or maybe competition from another group. If we're going to expose them, it has to be soon, before they disappear and re-establish somewhere else." That gave our work new urgency. Over the next week, Jin and I worked together to piece together everything we knew about the operation. I shared my photos and described in detail what I'd seen in that complex of buildings. Jin added information he'd gathered from other sources, financial records, shipping manifests, communications intercepts. The picture that emerged was horrifying in its scope and sophistication. The trafficking network moved dozens of women every month, recruiting them through fake job offers, tourist scams, and outright kidnapping. The victims were held in facilities throughout northern Thailand, drugged to keep them compliant, and then sold to clients around the world. But as we worked to build the case, the network was working faster than we were. Jin's sources started disappearing or refusing to talk. 2 women who had agreed to provide testimony suddenly left Thailand without explanation. Another potential witness was found dead in a Bangkok hotel room, officially ruled a suicide. "They know we're getting close," Jin told me during one of our meetings. "Someone is feeding them information about our investigation." That's when my visa problems started. I'd been in Thailand for almost 2 months on a tourist visa that was supposed to be good for 60 days. I'd planned to leave before it expired, but my involvement with Jin's investigation had kept me in the country longer than I'd intended. When I went to the immigration office to apply for an extension, I was told there were irregularities with my documents. "What kind of irregularities?" I asked the officer, a middle-aged man who spoke excellent English and seemed genuinely apologetic about the situation. "I am sorry, sir, but I cannot give you specific details. You must report to the main immigration office in Bangkok within 7 days for a formal review of your status." I knew this wasn't a coincidence. Someone with connections in the immigration department was putting pressure on my visa status, giving me a choice: leave Thailand immediately or face potential deportation and a ban on returning to the country. Jin was waiting for me outside the immigration office. "How bad is it?" he asked. 7 days, I said. "After that, I'm either on a plane home or in detention waiting for deportation." "Then, we need to publish the story now," Jin said. "Today, before they can silence you or force you to leave the country." But when Jin contacted his editor that afternoon, he received devastating news. The online magazine that had agreed to publish his investigation was backing out. They'd received pressure from advertisers, legal threats from unnamed parties, and suddenly decided that the story was too controversial for their platform. This is how it works. Jin explained to me as we sat in his small apartment, surrounded by months of research that might never see the light of day. They don't just threaten the witnesses and journalists. They go after the media companies, the funding sources, anyone who might give the story a platform. I felt the walls closing in around us. My visa was about to expire, forcing me to leave the country. Jin's investigation was being systematically dismantled by people with more power and connections than we could match. And somewhere in Chiang Mai, young women were still being held against their will while their captors prepared to relocate the entire operation. There has to be something we can do, I said. There is, Jin said quietly, but you're not going to like it. He explained that there was one media outlet still willing to publish the story, a small, independent website that specialized in investigative journalism about human trafficking. They had a reputation for taking on stories that mainstream media wouldn't touch, and they weren't susceptible to the kind of pressure that had scared off the larger publications. But they wanted more than just Jin's research and my testimony. They wanted current, verifiable evidence of the trafficking operation. Photos taken recently, documentation of ongoing crimes, proof that the network was still active and operating in the locations we'd identified. They want us to go back, I said. They want me to go back. Jin corrected. You're leaving the country in 6 days. Remember, but I need your help to find the location, to understand the layout, to know what I'm looking for. It was insane. We were talking about infiltrating a criminal organization that had already demonstrated they were willing to kill to protect their secrets. Jin was young and idealistic, but he wasn't stupid. He understood the risks as well as I did. Why? I asked him. Why is this story worth risking your life? Jin was quiet for a long time, staring at the photos spread across his desk, dozens of faces of young women who had disappeared, been trafficked, or been found dead in circumstances that authorities had dismissed as accidents or suicides. Because someone has to, he said finally. And because if we don't stop them here, they'll just move somewhere else and start over. The only way to break this cycle is to expose it so completely that they can't hide anymore. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I agreed to help Jin find the location where I'd been held, to provide him with the information he needed to document the ongoing operation. But I also told him that once I did that, I was done. I would leave Thailand, return to Portland, and try to rebuild some semblance of a normal life. I understand, Jin said. But I need you to know that once this story is published, there's no going back for either of us. These people have long memories and international connections. Publishing this story means accepting that we'll spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. The next morning, we began the process of trying to locate the complex where I'd been held. Using maps of the old quarter and my fragmented memories of that terrifying night, we narrowed down the possible locations to a few square blocks of connected buildings near the river. Jin had acquired a small camera that could transmit images wirelessly to a secure server, ensuring that even if he was caught, the evidence would survive. We planned for him to pose as a lost tourist, similar to how I had stumbled into the situation, and document whatever he could find before getting out safely. But as we prepared for what we both knew might be Jin's final investigation, we received news that changed everything. One of Jin's sources, a social worker who had been helping us identify victims, called with urgent information. They're moving tonight, she said. All the girls, all the equipment, everything. Someone tipped them off that law enforcement is planning raids tomorrow morning. Jin and I looked at each other across his cluttered apartment. If the network moved tonight, they would vanish into the maze of Southeast Asian criminal organizations, reappearing months later in a different city with new identities and new victims. Our investigation would be worthless, and all the women currently being held would disappear forever. We have to go now, Jin said. Tonight, before they move everything. That's suicide, I replied. If they're packing up operations, security will be at maximum. We'll never get close enough to document anything. We might not get another chance, Jin said. And those women, if they move them tonight, We may never find them again. I thought about the blonde girl I'd seen that first night, drugged and helpless on a thin mattress. I thought about all the faces in the photographs, all the names on the client lists, all the young women who had come to Thailand looking for adventure or opportunity and instead found themselves trapped in a nightmare. Okay, I said. But we do this smart. We get in, we get the evidence we need, and we get out. No heroics, no rescue attempts. We're journalists, not commandos. Jin nodded, but I could see in his eyes that he was already thinking beyond just documenting the operation. He was thinking about those women, about what would happen to them if we just watched them being loaded into trucks and driven away to some new location where they might never be found. As we prepared to leave for what might be our final investigation, I realized that my comfortable post-divorce retirement was over forever. Whether we succeeded or failed, whether we lived or died, I could never go back to being the person I'd been before I took that wrong turn in Chiang Mai. Some truths, once discovered, change you permanently. And the truth I'd discovered was that the world contained depths of evil I'd never imagined, operating with a sophistication and reach that made individual resistance seem pointless. But it also contained people like Jin, willing to risk everything to expose that evil and save its victims. As we walked through the dark streets toward the old quarter, I realized that for the first time since my divorce, I felt like I was doing something that mattered, something worth the risk, worth the fear, worth whatever consequences might follow. The complex was exactly where my fragmented memories had suggested it would be, hidden among a maze of connected shophouses that looked abandoned from the outside, but glowed with activity behind barred windows and locked doors. Jin and I crouched in an alley across the street, watching trucks being loaded with boxes, furniture, and what looked like industrial equipment. There, Jin whispered, pointing to a van parked near the main entrance. That's them. I followed his gaze and saw women being led from the building to the van. Young, Western-looking, moving with the slow, unsteady gait of people who had been heavily sedated. They were accompanied by handlers who guided them gently but firmly, speaking in soothing tones that couldn't quite hide the underlying threat. Jin was already taking photos with his wireless camera, the images uploading automatically to a secure server that would preserve the evidence even if we were caught. But as we watched the loading process, I realized we were witnessing something even worse than what I'd originally discovered. This wasn't just a trafficking operation being relocated. It was a shipment being prepared for export. The women were being packaged and prepared for transport to international destinations, sold to clients whose names and addresses I'd seen on those lists in the office. "We have to call the police," I whispered. "With what?" Jin replied. "By the time we convince anyone in authority to take us seriously, this convoy will be gone. These women will disappear into the international trafficking network, and we'll have nothing but photos that no one will believe." As we watched, more vans arrived, and the loading process accelerated. It was clear that this was a major operation, involving dozens of women and a support network that extended far beyond what could be managed by a few local criminals. "I'm going closer," Jin said, preparing to move from our hiding spot. "That's insane," I said, grabbing his arm. "They have guards. They're on high alert, and they've already demonstrated they're willing to kill witnesses." "Then this is our only chance," Jin said, shaking off my grip. "If I can get close enough to document the faces, the license plates, the destination information, we might be able to track where they're going." Before I could stop him, Jin was moving across the street, staying in the shadows but getting closer to the loading operation. I watched him navigate between parked cars and construction barriers, his camera recording everything he could see. That's when everything went wrong. One of the handlers noticed Jin's movement and called out in Thai. Within seconds, the loading stopped, and armed men began spreading out to search the area. Jin tried to retreat, but he'd gotten too close, and there was nowhere to hide. I watched from across the street as they surrounded him, took his camera, and began asking questions in rapid Thai and broken English. Jin was trying to play the role of a lost tourist, but it was clear that no one was buying his story. They were going to kill him. I could see it in their body language, in the way they were positioning themselves, in the calm, professional manner with which they were handling what they obviously considered a serious security breach. I had two choices. I could stay hidden and let Jin die while preserving my own safety, or I could try to create enough of a distraction to give him a chance to escape. I chose the distraction. I started shouting in English from across the street, making as much noise as possible while claiming to be Jin's friend looking for him. "Jin! Jin! Where are you? We're supposed to meet the other tourists at the hotel." The ruse worked for about 30 seconds, long enough for Jin to break free from his captors and start running, but not long enough for either of us to actually escape. They caught both of us within 2 blocks, and this time there was no pretending we were innocent tourists who had stumbled into the wrong place at the wrong time. They had Jin's camera, they had photos of us both, and they had no doubt about what we'd been trying to do. They brought us back to the complex, but not to the same room where I'd been held weeks earlier. This time, we were taken to what looked like an office space, with computers, filing cabinets, and walls covered with organizational charts that showed the scope of the trafficking network. Sirilawan was waiting for us, still looking like someone's grandmother, but now radiating an authority and coldness that made her earlier warmth seem like an elaborate performance. "Mr. Leo," she said, using my name for the first time, "you should have taken our advice and continued your journey home. Now you have made things very complicated for everyone." She turned to Jin and spoke to him in what sounded like fluent English, though her accent was thicker than when she'd been playing the role of a helpful local. "And you are the journalist who has been asking so many questions. Your investigation ends tonight." "People know where we are," Jin said, trying to project a confidence I could tell he didn't feel. "If we disappear, there will be more questions, more investigations." Sirilawan smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen on a human face. "Young man," she said, "do you have any idea how many people disappear in Southeast Asia every year? Tourists who take risks, journalists who investigate the wrong stories, idealists who think they can change the world. The authorities file reports, the families ask questions for a while, and then everyone moves on with their lives." She walked to one of the computers and brought up what looked like a database of names and photographs. "Your friend Leo here was scheduled to leave Thailand in 3 days anyway. His visa expires, he has no family waiting for him, no employer expecting him to return. When he fails to board his flight, it will be assumed he decided to extend his stay illegally and got into trouble with criminals or corrupt police." She clicked to another screen, showing Jin's photograph and personal information. "And you, Mr. Watanabe, are a freelance journalist with no steady employer and no family expecting regular contact. When you stop filing stories, it will be assumed you moved on to other projects or decided to change careers." The casual, bureaucratic way she discussed our disappearance was more frightening than any physical threat could have been. This wasn't personal for her, it was just business, a problem to be solved as efficiently as possible. "However," she continued, "you have created some complications that need to be addressed before we can proceed with your disposal." She showed us the photos Jin had taken with his wireless camera, all of which had been uploaded to his secure server before we were captured. "These images are evidence of our operation, and they exist on servers we cannot access. We need you to provide us with the login credentials so we can delete them." "And if we refuse?" Jin asked. "Then you will spend what remains of your lives watching us hurt the women you thought you were trying to save," Sirilawan said matter-of-factly. "We have no intention of letting your investigation interfere with our business, but we are willing to accelerate our timeline if necessary." She gestured toward a monitor that showed a live feed from another part of the complex. On the screen, I could see the blonde girl I'd encountered that first night, still drugged but now being prepared for transport. She was being dressed in clean clothes and given a suitcase, presumably to make her look like a willing traveler rather than a trafficking victim. "Her name is actually Emma," Sirilawan said, following my gaze. "She's from Melbourne, Came to Thailand 6 months ago for a backpacking trip. Her family thinks she's working at a hostel in Bangkok and plans to come home for Christmas. They have no idea she's about to begin a very different journey. What do you want from us? I asked. The login credentials for the server where these photos are stored. Siralawan repeated. Delete the evidence, and your deaths will be quick and relatively painless. Refuse, and we will make sure you watch every woman in this facility suffer before you die. Jin and I looked at each other, both understanding that we were facing an impossible choice. If we gave them access to delete the evidence, we would die, and the trafficking operation would continue. If we refused, we would still die, but we might save the photographic evidence that could eventually expose the network. But there was a third option, one that neither Siralawan nor her associates had considered. Jin's wireless camera had been uploading images automatically throughout our capture and interrogation. Every conversation, every threat, every glimpse of the operation we'd been given was being recorded and transmitted to the secure server. The longer they kept us alive to negotiate for the login credentials, the more evidence was being preserved. I need to think about it, Jin said, playing for time. This is a big decision. You have 5 minutes, Siralawan said. Then we begin demonstrating what happens to people who interfere with our business. As she left the room to give us time to consider our options, Jin leaned close to me and whispered, My camera is still recording. Everything she said, everything we've seen here, it's all being uploaded. Even if they kill us, the evidence will survive. How long before someone notices the uploads and realizes what happened to us? I asked. The system is set to send alerts if I don't check in within 24 hours, Jin said. By tomorrow night, people will know we're missing, and they'll have access to everything we've recorded. It wasn't much, but it was something. Our deaths might not be meaningless if the evidence we'd gathered could eventually bring down the trafficking network and save future victims. When Siralawan returned, we told her we needed more time to discuss the situation. Time is something we don't have, she said. The transport vehicles are loaded and ready to leave. We need to resolve this situation immediately. That's when we heard the sirens. At first, it was just 1 or 2 police cars in the distance, the kind of routine sound you might hear in any city at any time of night. But the sound grew louder and closer, and soon it was joined by more sirens, more vehicles. The unmistakable sound of a large-scale law enforcement operation. Siralawan's expression changed from calm control to confusion to something approaching panic. She spoke rapidly into a handheld radio, receiving responses that obviously weren't what she wanted to hear. It seems, she said to us, that someone has been more thorough in their investigation than we realized. The sirens were very close now, and we could hear shouting in Thai coming from other parts of the complex. Doors were being broken down, people were running, and the organized calm of the trafficking operation was dissolving into chaos. This is not over, Siralawan said, pulling a pistol from her desk drawer. If we are going down, we are taking as many people with us as possible. But, before she could point the gun at either Jin or me, the door to the office burst open, and Thai police officers in tactical gear flooded into the room. Siralawan dropped the weapon and raised her hands, but her expression showed rage rather than surrender. How? She asked, looking directly at me. How did you contact the authorities without phones, without access to the outside world? I looked at Jin, who was smiling for the first time since we'd been captured. We didn't, he said. But my editor did. When the photos and audio from tonight started uploading to our server, he realized we were in immediate danger and contacted international law enforcement agencies. They've been planning this raid for hours. The raid was swift and comprehensive. Within an hour, more than 30 women had been rescued from the complex, dozens of suspects had been arrested, and investigators were cataloging evidence that would eventually expose an international trafficking network spanning multiple countries. Emma, the blonde girl from Melbourne, was among the rescued victims. She was hospitalized for drug withdrawal and psychological evaluation, but she was alive and free for the first time in months. Jin and I were held for questioning for 3 days while authorities sorted out our role in the investigation. Eventually, we were released, but not before being warned that our lives might still be in danger from other members of the trafficking network who had not been arrested. You understand? The lead investigator told us that this operation was larger than what we shut down tonight. There are people in other countries, other cities, who will blame you for what happened here. I understood. My comfortable retirement was over, my plans to disappear into quiet anonymity destroyed by a wrong turn that had led me into the heart of something evil. From now on, I would have to live with the knowledge that there were people who wanted me dead, and with the responsibility of carrying the testimony that had helped expose their crimes. But as I watched the rescued women being taken to hospitals and safe houses, as I saw the evidence being catalogued that would eventually put their captors in prison, I realized that some wrong turns lead you exactly where you need to be. 3 months later, I'm still in Thailand, but not by choice. I'm in witness protection, waiting to testify in what prosecutors say will be one of the largest human trafficking trials in Southeast Asian history. Jin's investigation was eventually published by multiple international media outlets, and the story has led to similar raids in Cambodia, Myanmar, and the Philippines. The network Sirilawan ran was part of something much larger, something that moved thousands of women and children across international borders every year. Our investigation barely scratched the surface, but it was enough to save the women who were held in that complex and to put several major operators behind bars. I think about Emma sometimes, about whether she made it home to Melbourne and whether she'll ever fully recover from what was done to her. I think about all the other faces in those photographs, the ones who weren't rescued, who disappeared into the vast network of international trafficking before we could reach them. But mostly, I think about that moment when I had to choose between my safety and my conscience, between walking away from something evil and standing up to it, even when the odds were impossible. I spent 58 years living a safe, predictable life, avoiding risks and uncomfortable truths. It took getting lost in a foreign city to finally find the person I was supposed to be. Some secrets aren't meant to be discovered by accident, but once you've seen them, once you know they exist, they become your responsibility. The truth, no matter how dangerous or inconvenient, demands to be told. And that's why I'm still here, still looking over my shoulder, still carrying the weight of what I witnessed in those narrow alleys of Chiang Mai. Because some wrong turns aren't mistakes, they're appointments with the truth you've been avoiding your whole life. The secret I found behind that door changed everything I believed about the world, about my place in it, about what it means to be responsible for something larger than your own comfort and safety. I can't unsee what I saw, and I wouldn't want to, because unseeing it would mean abandoning the people who needed someone to witness their suffering and do something about it. 6 months later, I'm back in Portland, but I'm not the same person who left. The trial is over, the major players have been sentenced, and the trafficking network has been dismantled. The players have .com, but I know that others have taken their place, that somewhere in Southeast Asia, young women are still being drugged and trafficked and sold to men who see them as commodities rather than human beings. I volunteer now with anti-trafficking organizations, sharing my story with groups who can use it to educate others and raise awareness. It's not enough, it will never be enough, but it's something. And it's better than pretending I never saw what I saw, never learned what I learned about the darkness that exists just behind the postcard perfect image of paradise. Jin's article won several journalism awards and led to his being hired by a major international news organization. He covers human rights issues now, traveling to places where people disappear and stories get buried. We stay in touch, bound by the shared knowledge of what we witnessed and the choices we made when confronted with evil. Sometimes people ask me if I regret that wrong turn in Chiang Mai, if I wish I'd never seen what I saw. The honest answer is complicated. I regret the nightmares, the paranoia, the way I now see potential threats in every shadow. I regret that my comfortable, quiet retirement was destroyed, and that I can never go back to not knowing what I know. But I don't regret helping to save those women. I don't regret standing up to something monstrous when I had the chance. And I don't regret learning that even a middle-aged, divorced insurance adjuster from Portland can make a difference when the situation demands it. The secret I discovered in Chiang Mai wasn't just about human trafficking or organized crime. It was about myself, about the person I could become when everything comfortable and safe was stripped away. It was about the choice between looking away from injustice and facing it, even when facing it means risking everything. I took a wrong turn in Chiang Mai and found a secret I can't unsee. But what I really found was the courage to see it, to act on it, and to live with the consequences of doing what was right instead of what was easy. That's a secret worth carrying, even when the weight of it changes everything about who you thought you were and who you're going to become.